Welcome to Good Spirit Graphics. In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at what MochaBlend can do in Blender's movie clip editor. We'll be working with this part of MochaBlend's panel. In an earlier tutorial, I showed you how to do a corner pin in the 3D view. In that example, I was combining some 3D elements along with a traditional corner pin. Usually, you do a corner pin in the movie clip editor and the Compositor. Now in this example, we've tracked this picture frame, and if we turn on matte, you'll see we excluded the area inside the picture frame to capture the reflections and to not confuse the tracker. So let's go ahead and export this corner pin. We're going to select again After Effects Corner Pin Only and copy to clipboard. Now let's paste it in, and you'll see we have corner pin data loaded. We have another Mocha render mismatch here. Let's go ahead and import our Mocha format into Blender's render settings. And first off, let's create a corner pin mask. Now you'll see here we have our corner pin area outlined by our blue rectangle in Mocha, recreated here as a mask. If we go ahead and select Show Mask Overlay, you'll see what the alpha channel will be doing in the Compositor. And also, if we can click on Combined, you'll see the area we've isolated is the glass of the picture frame with the reflections from the room. Now let's go ahead to the Compositor and see what we can do with this. Now in the next tutorial, I'm going to show you how MochaBlend can help you create node layouts automatically. But for now, I'll show you how to create a simple layout to get access to our mask data. First, let's click on Use Nodes, and we'll go ahead and select our render layer node. That gives us our 3D camera output. Let's go ahead and hit Delete, get rid of that. Then we'll use some keyboard shortcuts to speed things up. Shift A. Let's put a movie clip node in here. We'll select our movie clip data block. Then we'll go ahead and create a mask node. We can select our mask data block, and we'll create one more node, an alpha over. We can move our composite node out of the way and add an output viewer to our alpha over here. Now let's go ahead and connect these guys up. We'll connect the output of our movie clip node to one input of our alpha over. We'll take the output of our mask node, connect it to the alpha or FAC input here on the alpha over. And if we click on our viewer node and set our UV image editor to viewer node, we'll be able to see the output of the alpha over. Now you'll see here the background of our output is white. That's because our alpha over has no input here. You can actually make it any color you want, or we can just put a background image in there. Now let's go take a look at one more thing. I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate our viewer. We'll take a look at our mask layer. Press this viewer, and if we click on Backdrop again, it'll pop into our background here. Now we can zoom our background by using keyboard V or Alt V, or more accurately, we can go ahead and open up the right panel with keyboard shortcut In. And in here, we'll have a more sensitive zoom control over our background image. Now we can go ahead and click on Anti-Alias. You'll see our edges here smooth up a little bit. We can zoom in on it and see. And we can also add motion blur. You'll see here our edges now are going to have motion blur, and it's going to go up and down depending on how much our camera was moving on any given frame. Now if we want to output either our mask or our isolated image, all we need to do is connect the output of our alpha over to our composite node and go ahead and render. You'd probably want this black in that case, but you can output either one. Now we'll do one last thing. I'm going to drop in an image from a folder. It will create an image node automatically. We'll go ahead and throw this output to the alpha over input, and you'll see we can easily superimpose our isolated screen reflections over any background we want. Now let's go back to the movie clip editor and take a look at how we can work with an actual corner pin. With corner pin data loaded, we can also create corner pin trackers. Now we're in mask mode right now, but if we click on Create Corner Pin Trackers, it's going to throw us into tracking mode, and you'll see we have 4 trackers now created at the corners of where our blue surface was in Mocha. We can select all these trackers by pressing A. A alternately selects and deselects everything in a part of Blender, or you can press C for circle select and go ahead and select them that way. Once we have them all selected, we're going to go down to Plane Track and create a plane track. We're going to position the corners of the plane track right on our trackers here. Now you can zoom in as close as you want and get subpixel accuracy if you want. Probably not going to matter for this example. All right, there we go. Now our plane track is going to be moving along with our corner pin trackers. Now let's go back to the Compositor and see what we can do with this. Now let's go ahead and create a new node here for our corner pin. We'll go Shift Add, and under Distort, we're going to select the inexplicably named Plane Track Deform. This is a corner pin node. Let's go ahead and click on that, put it in place. If we zoom in on it, we're going to follow our data block hierarchy again. We're going to picture frame fields. That's the one we want. That is our footage data block. Then we select our object data block, which is camera. That's where we put our trackers. Then we're going to select our plane track. Now we're going to go ahead and put an image into here. We don't really want this background image here, so let's go ahead and drag and drop another picture. And this time we'll drag it into the UV image editor down here. Here's James Dean again. Now any image we put in here is accessible in our image node. So let's go ahead and select that. We'll take that output and put it into our plane track deform. Now if we go ahead and we'll throw another output viewer here, connect that up just so we can see it isolated. You'll see we have our image corner pinned into the correct part of our screen. Now let's combine it with our footage. We'll go ahead and take the output of our plane track deform here and throw it into our alpha over. Put it in the bottom input here. And let's go ahead and disconnect the image from that input and reconnect our footage. Now if we select this viewer here, we'll have our plane track deform inserted into our final product. Now if we render this out, it's going to look very artificial because first of all, it's way too bright, and second of all, we've lost our reflections. It's just sort of sitting on top of our image. So let's go ahead and swap out our alpha over. We're going to add in a mix node. And we're going to go ahead and move all these connections over. We're going to take the output of our mix node to our composite node so we can render. And also, let's go ahead and take this viewer, connect it up so we can see what we have. Well, it looks like we have things a little backwards here. No, we are missing the output here. All right, there we go. Now we don't want mix, we want screen when we're trying to blend in reflections. There we go. And also, our source image is way too bright. So let's add a color balance, possibly even a hue saturation and value node. Actually, let's keep it simple here, and let's just use this one for now. We'll go ahead and swap this out. And then we will lower our brightness a little bit, or actually quite a lot, to make it blend in with the room better. Now if we move our image around here, you're going to see that we have our reflections. Here we go, you can see the outline here of one of the reflections blended in now. So since we're all connected to our composite node output, let's go ahead and render this out. Here's our render result, and as you can see, our corner pin is sticking perfectly to the corners of the picture frame. I'm going to stop it halfway through because this tutorial is only shot at 15 frames per second, so it's not going to look as smooth to you as it does to me. Now this isn't a compositing tutorial, but let me point out a couple things that could help you make this image even better. If you look at the edges of the picture frame, you'll see some jagged lines. That's the telltale sign of interlaced footage. But our picture insert is not interlaced, obviously, so when we mix two things together like this, it doesn't always look right. It would be best to de-interlace our source footage first before we try to combine it with still images like this. Also, the source footage has a color cast to it, while our insert shot looks very black and white, so some color correction to tie these two things together would improve the shot a lot. In addition, you'll see some motion blur on the chair and on the table, but you don't see any in the insert shot. We need to add some kind of blur into this to try to make it look like it's actually part of the scene. And finally, you probably want to add some lens distortion into the insert shot so it matches the lens distortion of the source footage. Now let's head back to Blender and fix a couple of these things. Now before we look at the node layout, let me say something about Blender's backdrop. If you look at the edge of the picture frame, you'll see the effect of the interlaced footage is exaggerated. That's due to the zoom setting here. If we set this to more even multiples or divisions of the original image, you'll see that will disappear. Now let's take a look at the color correction first. That'll be the easiest thing to fix. You can see I moved the color balance over here. It's connected to the mix node here, which is set to screen. And although we didn't render it, we can go ahead and click on this viewer node here, and you'll see it's putting a color correction across the whole screen. Now what that does is make the whites in the black and white image look more similar to the whites on the wall, and you can see if we exaggerate it, everything tends to blend in and look like it was shot together. You don't want to go too far with this because it'll start to look very artificial if you pull it too far in any direction. Now if we want to render that, we'll take this output here and move it to our composite node. As of Blender 2.69, we don't have any way to get true 2D motion blur into our image here. If we take a look at the plane track deform node, you'll see we're not getting any output that will let us blur it in that way. So what we have to do is cheat. We can use either a standard blur and add it to one axis, like in this case. The image is moving mostly horizontally. we could add some blur on the x-axis, maybe a little bit on the y, and our image will end up looking a lot more accurate. That might be going a little too far. Let's back this off to 3 and 1. And if we render this out, it will look a lot better. Another way is to use the directional blur node. With this, we could keyframe in some distance and angle settings, and then adjust for more pronounced areas of the image where the motion blur is more exaggerated. There is a feature request in for this, so hopefully soon there will be a plane track deform output here with motion blur. Until then, you can get true motion blur into your image by rendering this out in the 3D view. That's what I did in the earlier example where I added a 3D cigarette and smoke to the scene. Now you may have noticed when we originally composited this image, we didn't use the alpha output of our plane track deform node here. I'll show you why. If we go ahead and connect an output viewer to this, you'll see that the edges are not anti-aliased, and we don't get the option of applying motion blur to these edges either. Now, since MochaBlend can create a mask for you from your corner pin data that does give you anti-aliasing, feathering, and motion blur, why not just use that? Finally, our image does not have any lens correction put on it, but Blender does have a lens distortion module, so go ahead and check that out. It's beyond the scope of this tutorial, but it will give you a better final result. One of the reasons people like to rotoscope in Mocha is because it just makes it easier. Once you get a track on a plane in your image, like the front of this car, and you want to rotoscope around some shapes, all you have to do is draw a spline around it and then parent it to that track. As you can see, I don't have any keyframes on this left headlight, yet it's following with all the transforms of our track. Now you can do the same thing in Blender, simply by selecting your track, exporting your tracking data, and selecting corner pin. In Blender, we're going to convert Mocha's track into a Blender planar solution. Let's go ahead and paste in our corner pin data, which actually contains all Mocha's track transformations. Now before we do it, let's go ahead and create another object here. You don't have to do this, but if you have other trackers on your camera, let's go ahead and isolate things a little bit to keep it organized. We can change the name of this to Mocha Track, and go ahead and create our corner pin trackers. They will now be created here in the Mocha Track object. Now let's circle select our trackers here. Go down to Plane Track and press this button. This will do the conversion for us. Once we get Blender's plane track corners, let's go ahead and position these one by one on the 4 trackers. Perfect precision isn't necessary here, but you can zoom in as much as you want. I haven't found that it makes much of a difference once you get it close. That's it. We're done. Now if you want to hide the plane track temporarily, go ahead and just click on a different object. Now we'll move over to masking mode and see how easy this is. We'll zoom in on an area we want to rotoscope around. Hold down Control and left click around the grill, for example. We'll double click to close our spline. Then let's just select all our points and go ahead and highlight our Mocha track. Then if we go down to Make Parent or press Control P, we're going to parent our spline to our track. Now let's turn off our track for a second just so we can see things better. And if we did things right, our spline will now follow all the transformations of our Mocha track. We can display just that area by clicking on Show Mask Overlay. We'll get our alpha channel, or we'll get the area that we've isolated. There you go. easy rotoscoping in Blender with a Mocha track. Now, just like in Mocha, we can go ahead and fine-tune our shape by adding some keyframes to it. Let's go ahead and put our timeline on frame 1. We'll split our window so you can see our keyframes. We'll open up the dope sheet here, switch it to mask, and I'll go ahead and zoom our timeline with the middle mouse wheel a little bit. Now, if we go ahead and select a point, actually with all of them selected, let's go ahead and press keyboard I. That will put a master keyframe for our shape. Then we can go ahead and move to another frame where we want to adjust it. Let's just select one point here and maybe move that up a little bit. We'll press keyboard I. And you'll see if we go between these two positions, that one keyframe is only adjusting that one point, and everything's riding on top of the Mocha track. Now let's add a little feather to our spline here. We'll press keyboard A to select everything, and Alt S to drag out a feather. Now, if your version of Blender doesn't have these constraint lines, that's because I'm using my Zorro branch of Blender, and I put these in here to make it clear what are the prime feather points and what are the child feather points. If I hold down Shift, we can left click and create a child feather point, but it can only live between these 2 points, and you can see more clearly which is which. Finally, one last point to save you some time. This green feather line here needs to be outside your main spline to work correctly. If it isn't, go ahead and click on Switch Direction. You'll see it will switch it from outside to inside, or, more usefully, from inside to outside. Now we're going to export some shapes from Mocha to Blender's Movie Clip Editor. Last time we exported shapes, we did so to Blender's 3D view. When we export to the Movie Clip Editor, we can export a couple of extra layer properties. Each layer will now have its layer name, layer order, layer in-out points, layer blend mode, and lastly, its layer invert property exported. Now we have Rotocar highlighted, so let's go ahead, click on Export Shape Data, pick Nuke Rotopaint, and copy to clipboard. Now let's go ahead and paste this data into MochaBlend, and under the Movie Clip Editor, let's create a shape mask. We just got an error. MochaBlend is reporting this version of Blender does not support this function. I showed you this so you would see what would happen if you don't use at least Blender 2.71. Older versions of Blender do not support Bezier curves in the Movie Clip Editor. For the rest of this tutorial, I went ahead and used the Good Spirit Graphics custom branch of Blender called the Zorro branch. Take note of the question marks here in the format information. If you remember from an earlier tutorial, the Nuke Rotopaint export format does not contain resolution, frames per second, or pixel aspect ratio information. As a result, import Mocha format will not work because there's nothing to import. So you have two choices here. You can either go back to Mocha and export some tracking data, which is the simplest way, or you can go over to Blender's settings by switching over one of the windows to the Properties panel and setting this information yourself. I prefer to use this method. It's simpler. Go ahead and export some tracking data. You can pick corner pin data or transform data as long as it's the After Effects format. Copy to clipboard and paste that in first. There we go. Now we have all our settings. Our Import Mocha Format button is activated, so we can bring all those settings into Blender. And I'm going to go ahead and move my MochaBlend panel up to the top to clean things up a little bit. Now let's go back to Mocha and actually get our shapes. I have Rotocar selected, and before I export it, I want you to notice something. If I go ahead and select all my points, you're going to see we have 3 keyframes on this shape. I also intentionally unset the link to track. Let's see what happens if we export this into MochaBlend. Selected layer is good. Copy to clipboard. Now before I paste it in, take a look at here. We have a frame range from 1 to 24, and it says 24 frames. Now this number doesn't actually mean the number of frames you have, it's the number of keyframed frames you have. So if we paste in our shape, you'll see it now says 3. That's the number of keyframes we had in Mocha for that spline. So if we create a shape with only 3 keyframes, it's not going to follow the car very well. So let's go back to Mocha and fix it. With Rotocar selected, we'll go ahead and link our shape to our track. Make sure it's following it correctly. Very good. Now let's export it completely. Now let's paste this data in. You'll see now we're showing 24 keyframed frames. That's because Mocha's track is filling in the other 21 frames. Now we're good to create our shape mask. And as you'll see, it fits on our car perfectly. And it's using Mocha's track to follow the car. Now let's export all the layers from Mocha. But before we do, I want to show you that I've set all the layers except one to a blend mode of add. Left headlight here is set to subtract. Now notice it is above the Rotocar layer. Now when we go into Blender, you're going to see why you might want to put it under if you wanted to actually subtract from the Rotocar layer properly. Let's export our shape data, select all visible layers, and copy to clipboard. Now before we paste in our data, let's clear out these layers we don't need. And you'll see now we're getting a reading of 6 splines. When you have multiple splines in here, it no longer shows the number of keyframe frames you have. Let's go ahead and create our shape mask. And you'll see we have all our layers. A couple of them are going to pop into view. If we move our timeline, there we go. So you see what we're getting here is layer name, layer in-out points, and if we select our left headlight, you'll see it is set to subtract. Now let's go ahead and turn on mask display. And if we go on down and set show mask overlay, you'll see everything is adding. Now this is what I warned you about. In Blender, if we want a layer to subtract from the other layers, it needs to be not over it, but under it. So let's go ahead and move it down with this arrow key. Then I think if we update our timeline one, you'll see it is subtracting from the other mask. Now let's go ahead and set our display mode here to combined, and you'll see we have our car isolated. All our mask layers are animated. They're popping in and out of view according to our layer in-out times in Mocha, and everything is working perfectly.